The battle was over. At least, that's what the victors believed. The last enemy warship had been reduced to glowing debris, its shattered remains drifting lifelessly through the void. The victorious fleet, sleek, advanced, and confident, gathered, in formation, their weapons cooling, their commanders already preparing for the next phase of their conquest. But then, something changed. A single blip appeared on their sensors. A lone ship, emerging from the shadows of a distant gas giant. It was moving fast. Too fast. And the moment they locked onto it, they realized their mistake. It wasn't an enemy remnant. It wasn't a fleeing survivor. It was something else entirely. Something far worse. A Terran warship. The Galactic Dominion, an empire of 1,000 worlds, had never feared humanity. Why would they? The Dominion had crushed entire civilizations before, sweeping aside lesser species with ease. Their fleets were enormous, their technology centuries ahead of most known races. And humanity? Humanity was barely out of its cradle, just another upstart race in a galaxy teeming with them. The Dominion had fought battles against the humans before. Minor skirmishes, border disputes, easily resolved with overwhelming firepower. The humans had always been persistent, but never truly dangerous. Not until now. The war had started as a simple territorial expansion. The Dominion had encountered a human colony on the fringes of their controlled space, a minor settlement on an unremarkable planet. The humans, as always, had refused to surrender. They fought back. Hard. The Dominion responded as they always did, with force. A battle fleet was dispatched, and the war was supposed to be over in days. But something had gone wrong. The humans hadn't fought like before. Their ships were faster, more durable, and their strategies were unpredictable. They adapted too, quickly, their commanders making decisions that no Dominion strategist could have foreseen. And then there were the warships, the new ones. Not the aging cruisers the Dominion had encountered before, but something far more dangerous. Weapons that shouldn't have existed. Shields that absorbed energy like nothing seen before. And something even worse. Tactics that defied every known rule of space combat. The Dominion fought back with all their might, throwing fleet after fleet into the conflict. But the battles stretched on. Weeks turned into months, and finally, after an enormous struggle, they had managed to corner the human forces in one final engagement. The Dominion's Grand Admiral, a veteran of countless wars, had watched with satisfaction as the last human warship was torn apart in a barrage of energy fire. The battle had been costly, but victory was theirs. The war would finally be over. Then, the lone warship arrived. At first it seemed insignificant. A single vessel against an entire battle fleet? It was laughable. The Dominion commanders barely paid it any attention, dismissing it as an outdated Terran relic or a desperate escapee. But then, the scans came back. This was no ordinary warship. Its hull was an alloy the Dominion had never seen before. Its energy readings were off the charts, and its speed was impossible. And then it fired. The Dominion fleet had faced countless enemies before, from planetary militias to advanced warfaring civilizations. They had crushed fleets 10 times their size, shattered armadas with a single strategic strike, and erased entire species that stood in their way. Yet, nothing could have prepared them for the weapon that fired from the lone Terran warship. It wasn't an energy beam or a torpedo, not the plasma lances or particle disruptors the Dominion had grown accustomed to countering. It was something new, something terrifying. A single bolt of golden light erupted from the ship's hull, moving faster than anything the Dominion's sensors could properly track. It crossed the vast emptiness of space in an instant and struck the lead Dominion battleship, a vessel that had survived wars, crushed rebellions, and withstood planetary bombardments. The ship ceased to exist. No explosion, no debris, no energy. Signature that the Dominion's advanced sensors could decipher. The moment the bolt of light struck, the battleship was gone. Not destroyed, erased. A moment of silence fell across the battlefield. The Dominion commanders, watching from their flagships, couldn't comprehend what had just happened. One of their most powerful warships had simply vanished from existence. No warnings, no distress signals. 1 second, it had been there. its shields up, its weapons charged. The next, nothing. Panic spread through the Dominion fleet. "Impossible," the Grand Admiral whispered. "That's not a weapon. That's annihilation." The fleet scrambled to react, their thousands of turrets, missile bays, and energy cannons locking onto the Terran warship. The Dominion had learned, long ago, that even the most powerful enemy could be overwhelmed with sheer numbers. No matter how advanced the humans had become, they were still outnumbered. The Dominion had superior firepower. They had experience. They had won the battle. But the ship moved, and suddenly it was among them. It hadn't activated a warp drive. It hadn't engaged an afterburner. It had simply moved. One moment, it had been in the distance, a lone speck against the black void. The next, it was within their formation, drifting like a silent predator. And in that instant, the battle changed. Dominion warships were enormous, city-sized constructs of metal and plasma, each carrying the firepower to wipe out entire planets. Their formations were designed for efficiency, maximizing their interlocking shields and creating impenetrable defensive grids. Yet none of it mattered. The human warship wove between them as if they were standing still, evading their targeting systems with ease. The Dominion fired everything they had: torrents of plasma, hyper-accelerated railgun rounds, high-energy torpedoes, all aimed directly at the Terran warship. The void itself seemed to light up as thousands of weapons discharged at once, the raw energy of a small sun unleashed in an attempt to destroy the lone vessel. And yet, it remained untouched. The attacks phased through it, as if striking a ghost. Some Dominion commanders thought their targeting systems had malfunctioned. Others believed the humans had developed a cloaking field beyond comprehension. But then came the realization. Their weapons weren't passing through an illusion. The warship was bending reality itself. One by one, the Dominion ships began disappearing. No explosions, no wreckage. The Terran warship moved through their ranks, and with every shot it fired, another Dominion vessel simply ceased to exist. The Grand Admiral watched in horror as his fleet, his unstoppable, empire-crushing fleet, was reduced to nothingness in mere moments. Then, for the first time in Dominion history, the order was given. Retreat. It was unthinkable. The Dominion had never run from a battle. Surrender was not in their doctrine. They had raised civilizations for lesser offenses than defying their rule. And yet, faced with this single warship, they had no choice. The fleet turned, their engines burning at maximum capacity as they fled from the battlefield. But deep down, they all knew the truth. It was too late. The Dominion fleet was in full retreat. Battleships, cruisers, and destroyers, vessels that had once brought entire star systems to their knees, were now running for their survival. Their thrusters burned with desperation, engines straining as they pushed beyond safe operational limits. Yet, for all their speed, for all their efforts, the lone Terran warship followed. It did not rush. It did not pursue with the frenzy of a predator eager for the kill. Instead, it drifted forward with an eerie, mechanical patience, as if it had all the time in the universe. And perhaps it did. How is this possible? The Grand Admiral's voice was barely above a whisper, but the command deck of his flagship was dead silent. No one answered. No one could. The Dominion had ruled the galaxy for millennia. Their technology was supreme, their fleets were unmatched, and yet, here they were, fleeing from a single warship that defied every known law of physics, every known limit of military engineering. And it wasn't just the weapons, it wasn't just the impossible speed, the reality-warping defenses, or the vanishing ships. No, there was something more, something beyond technology. Fear. Not just the natural fear of death, of defeat. This was something deeper, something primal. A terror that had embedded itself into the very fabric of the Dominion fleet's collective consciousness. A whisper at the edges of their minds that told them they weren't just facing an enemy. They were facing the end of everything they understood. The Terran warship had not hailed them. It had sent no threats, no warnings, no demands for surrender. It simply followed and erased them from existence, one by one. "Get me a hyperspace window," the Grand Admiral bellowed, snapping out of his trance. The order sent the command crew into action, their fingers moving frantically across control panels as they tried to force open a rift in space-time. An escape route. A last chance to flee before the impossible ship reached them. But then, the lights flickered. A low hum reverberated through the flagship's hull. A sound that didn't come from their own systems. It was external. A frequency so deep, it felt like it was resonating inside their bones. The crew clutched at their ears, their expressions twisting in agony as the sound became a vibration, a pulse, a voice, not words, not language, something deeper, something that bypassed thought entirely and burrowed straight into their instincts. A message, there is no escape, and then, silence. Every Dominion warship's systems flickered offline for a single agonizing moment. In the vastness of space, in the middle of their desperate retreat, their engines died, their shields collapsed, and every single sensor went dark. They were blind, deaf, and helpless in the void. Then the flickering stopped, and everything came back online, but the Dominion fleet was no longer surrounded by stars. They were somewhere else. The command crew gasped as the view screens displayed the impossible. They had been in open space, near the orbit of a barren moon, with a clear escape path through hyperspace. But now they were in a graveyard, a cosmic cemetery, stretching as far as the eye could see. Derelict ships, shattered hulls, twisted metal remains drifting through the void like ghosts of battles long forgotten. Some were ancient, their origins unknown. Others were Dominion vessels, ships that had vanished throughout history, presumed, lost in war or to hyperspace accidents. But the most disturbing sight was the human ships, hundreds of them, thousands. Vessels from different eras of human history, some so old they shouldn't have even had the capability to reach this deep into space. And yet, here they were, silent, lifeless, suspended in the dark. "This isn't possible!" one of the officers whispered. The Grand Admiral didn't respond. He couldn't, because he knew, deep down, that this was not a place where they had arrived. This was a place they had been taken, and the warship, the Terran warship, was still there. It floated at the edge of the graveyard, as still as the dead ships surrounding it. Waiting. Watching. Then, the Dominion's sensors screamed. Something was moving. Not just the warship, not just one thing. Everything. The graveyard was waking up. One by one, the derelict vessels, some centuries old, some millennia, began to shift. Hulls that had been dormant for eons flickered with dying embers of energy. Weapons that had rusted, in the vacuum of space, began to glow with renewed power. The lifeless husks turned, moving with unnatural synchronization. The Dominion fleet was surrounded, not just by human ships, but by something more. A force beyond technology, beyond war. And for the first time in his long, illustrious career, the Grand Admiral of the Dominion fleet understood what it meant to lose. The bridge of the Dominion flagship was a tomb of silence, the crew paralyzed by the sheer impossibility of what they were witnessing. The graveyard of ships had become a battlefield before a single shot had been fired. The vast, drifting wrecks, some as ancient as the stars themselves, were moving with a purpose that defied reason. These were not derelicts reclaimed by scavengers, nor were they the lifeless husks of fallen fleets. They were responding. To what? The Grand Admiral could not say. The data on his displays was fragmented, contradicting itself with every passing moment. Some ships registered as entirely offline, their power signatures flatlining into nothingness. Others displayed readings so impossibly advanced they might as well have been weapons crafted by gods. And then, there was the Terran warship. Was still there, still watching, still silent. But the Dominion fleet was no longer the dominant force in this encounter. They were trapped in a place they did not understand, surrounded by vessels that should not move, should not exist, should not think, and yet they did. The Grand Admiral clenched his jaw, his mind racing. He was a man who had survived 100 battles, a veteran of interstellar campaigns that had shattered empires and rewritten history. And yet, here, In this forsaken abyss, he felt something unfamiliar creeping into his bones. Helplessness. "Status report," he snapped, his voice cutting through the stunned silence. His crew flinched at the sound but obeyed. Data flickered across their displays, and the officers called out readings that made no sense. Shields at full power. No, wait, they just dropped to 10%. Back up to 60, fluctuating erratically. Engines. Functional. But something is interfering with thrust control. Long-range sensors are offline. Short-range scanners. The officer hesitated, then turned pale. "Sir, they're reading life signs aboard the derelicts." The Grand Admiral stiffened. Impossible. But the readings didn't lie. All around them, within the wrecks that had drifted lifeless for centuries, something stirred. Faint biosignatures, weak and fragmented, pulsed through the remains of shattered warships. It was as if the very void had breathed life back into the fallen, or something else had claimed them. Then, the Terran warship moved. Not a slow, deliberate drift like before. Not the mechanical patience of a predator toying with its prey. No. This time, it surged forward like a tidal wave of inevitability. The Grand Admiral's instincts screamed. "Evasive maneuvers! Full power to the engines!" The Dominion flagship's thrusters roared to life, its enormous bulk straining against invisible forces that seemed to hold it in place. The fleet followed suit, but no matter how hard they pushed their engines, they did not move. Panic spread like wildfire. "Sir, we're caught in some kind of gravitational lock." "No, it's not gravity, it's—" The officer never finished his sentence. Because in that moment, the first shot was fired. Not from the Dominion fleet, not from the derelicts, from the Terran warship. A single beam of light, if it could even be called that, lanced through the void. It wasn't laser fire. It wasn't plasma. It wasn't energy in any known sense. It ripped through space-time itself, bending the very fabric of reality as it surged forward. It struck the nearest Dominion cruiser, and the cruiser ceased to exist. No explosion. No debris. No wreckage drifting into the void. One moment, the ship was there. The next, it was gone, erased from existence as if it had never been built, as if the countless lives aboard had never drawn breath, as if history itself had forgotten it. The Dominion fleet froze. A moment of silence. Then chaos. "All ships, open fire." The Grand Admiral bellowed, his voice raw with desperation. A barrage of energy weapons, railguns, and torpedoes filled the void. The fleet unleashed every ounce of firepower at their disposal, hurling destruction at the lone Terran warship. None of it mattered. Lasers bent away before impact, as if space itself refused to allow them to strike their target. Kinetic rounds slowed to a crawl, then simply vanished before touching the hull. Missile guidance systems failed, causing warheads to drift harmlessly, some detonating against the derelict wrecks instead. And the Terran warship retaliated. Another pulse of that impossible weapon, and another Dominion battleship was erased from existence. And then another, and another. Panic became hysteria. The once mighty Dominion fleet, which had razed entire civilizations to the ground, was now reduced to screaming officers and desperate attempts to flee. Except they could not flee. Something was holding them in place. Something far greater than a mere technological advantage. Something old. The Grand Admiral's mind raced for an explanation. Some kind of Terran superweapon? Some forgotten human experiment left adrift in the void? Then his communications officer gasped, eyes wide with disbelief. "Sir, we're receiving a transmission." The bridge fell silent. A transmission? The Terran warship had been silent all this time. No threats, no demands, no ultimatums. Just cold, methodical annihilation. The Grand Admiral hesitated, then gave a sharp nod. "Patch it through." The view screen flickered to life. For the first time, the Dominion fleet would see the face of their enemy. A figure emerged from the static. Not a machine. Not an alien monstrosity. A man. His uniform was old, outdated by at least 1,000 years, the insignia of a long-forgotten Terran fleet emblazoned on his chest. His face was human, but his eyes were something else entirely. Ancient, endless, like they had seen too much, like they had seen everything. And when he spoke, his voice carried not just across the Dominion flagship, but through the void itself. You were given a chance to leave. It was not a threat. It was not anger. It was a sentence. And as the transmission ended, the Dominion fleet realized the truth. This was not just a Terran warship. It was a judgment. And judgment had come. The Dominion fleet, once the embodiment of supreme conquest, was now reduced to terrified, scrambling vessels caught in the grip of something beyond comprehension. The eerie stillness of the void was shattered by the panicked voices of captains, admirals, and officers screaming across fractured communication channels. Tactical readouts flashed with desperate attempts to analyze the anomaly before them, but none could offer a rational explanation. The Grand Admiral stood motionless, staring at the blank screen where the human's face had just been. There was no bravado, no gloating in the man's voice, only a cold certainty, as if the outcome had been decided long before this battle even began. And perhaps it had. "Status of our remaining ships," the Grand Admiral demanded, his voice steady despite the terror crawling up his spine. The response was grim. "We've lost 22 vessels. All gone, sir. Not destroyed. Not damaged. Erased. Whatever that weapon is, it's not conventional. It doesn't leave wreckage, doesn't leave radiation signatures. It doesn't even register on our sensors. It's as if those ships never existed in the first place." The Grand Admiral clenched his fists. This was not how battles were fought. Even in the face of overwhelming firepower, there were always calculations, tactical withdrawals, sacrificial maneuvers, strategies that turned the tide. But how do you fight something that rewrites the rules of reality itself? A new alert sounded. Across the flagship. "Sir," one of the officers called out, his voice strained with disbelief. "The derelicts, they're moving." The Grand Admiral turned toward the main viewport, and what he saw sent a cold spike of dread through his body. The ancient ships, once lifeless husks drifting in eternal silence, were now awakening. Dim emergency lights flickered to life along shattered hulls. Glistening metallic surfaces, worn by millennia, shimmered with a strange, eerie energy. Some of these vessels were older than the Dominion itself, relics of wars fought in ages lost to time. And now, they moved with purpose. The Dominion fleet was no longer alone in this battle. "We are detecting power fluctuations within the derelicts," the science officer reported, his hands trembling over his console. They're activating weapons systems." Impossible. These ships had been abandoned for centuries, longer even. How could their weaponry, their systems, their very cores still function? Then, with chilling clarity, the Grand Admiral understood. It was the warship. The human warship. It was not simply attacking them. It was commanding the graveyard itself. A transmission flickered onto the screen again, but this time, it was not from the warship. It was a faint, broken signal, broadcast in multiple ancient languages. A voice, fragmented and hollow, whispered through the static. "They are coming back. They never left. They never left." The voice faded into nothingness. A moment later, the first derelict fired. A beam of raw energy erupted from the shattered remains of a battleship so ancient that its origins were unknown. It lanced across the void, carving through a Dominion destroyer like a hot knife through ice. The ship didn't explode. It simply collapsed in on itself, matter folding inward as though being devoured by the very darkness around it. Panic surged through the Dominion fleet. "They're attacking! The derelicts are attacking us! This isn't possible! They're abandoned! Sir, we're losing control of navigation. Our systems are locking us out." The Grand Admiral turned sharply. "What do you mean, locking us out?" The officer's face was pale. "Some kind of external interference. It's overriding our command systems. Someone else is at the helm." And that was when the Dominion fleet truly understood. The warship wasn't alone. It had never been alone. It had merely been waiting. Waiting for the right moment to awaken something older. Something far worse than even itself. Something that should have stayed buried. Aboard the flagship, the Grand Admiral struggled to maintain control. But the Dominion's legendary discipline had begun to crumble. Officers shouted over one another, desperate to make sense of what was happening. Ships that had once been at the peak of military supremacy now found themselves outnumbered by the ghosts of the past. Ghosts that had been given new purpose by the unseen hand of the human warship. "Sir, should we attempt to retreat?" An officer asked, his voice unsteady. Retreat? That was an option before, but now? The Grand Admiral watched as more Dominion ships vanished, consumed by forces they could not comprehend. The human warship had fired only twice, and yet half of his once mighty fleet was already lost. The derelicts moved in unison, not like scavengers, not like random drifting relics, but like an army. A silent, relentless, unforgiving army. The Grand Admiral knew the bitter truth. This was no longer a battle. This was a reckoning. "Send a message to the Terran warship," he ordered, his voice finally betraying a hint of desperation. "Tell them we surrender." His communications officer hesitated. "Sir, I don't think they care." A cold realization settled over the bridge. This wasn't a war between empires. It wasn't a territorial dispute or a conflict over resources. This was something far older, something fundamental. The Terran warship wasn't fighting to win. It was fighting to erase, to wipe clean the stain of those who had trespassed where they should not have gone. And the Dominion had stepped into the very heart of something it could never control. The Grand Admiral took a slow breath. His fingers curled into fists, not in anger, but in resignation. He had commanded countless battles. He had led his people to victory against impossible odds. He had defied fate time and time again. But fate had finally come to collect, and it wore the face of a human. The Dominion fleet, once the embodiment of terror across the known galaxy, was now a collection of scattered, panicked vessels, their mighty armada reduced to smoldering wreckage and ghostly echoes in the void. The silence between the screams on the comm channels was more unnerving than the chaos itself. The once mighty war machine of the Dominion had never known fear like this. It had never been hunted, and yet, here it was, being dismantled by something beyond its comprehension. The Grand Admiral stood frozen on the bridge of his flagship, his mind desperately clawing for a strategy, any strategy. But none came. His experience, his battle-hardened instincts, his unparalleled tactical mind, none of it mattered anymore. He wasn't just fighting a war. He was standing on the precipice of annihilation. "Sir," the communications officer stammered, his hands shaking over the controls. "Our surrender transmission. It's not being acknowledged." The Grand Admiral's jaw clenched. Not acknowledged. Not ignored. That would imply an enemy willing to negotiate, to consider terms. But no. The humans simply weren't even listening. This was no longer a battle. This was eradication. And then the voice returned. Not from a Dominion ship, not from the humans, but from the derelicts, the ships thought to be long dead. It was layered, ancient, and in a dozen different dialects from civilizations long since vanished. Some words were in the Dominion's own tongue, others in languages spoken by empires that had crumbled into dust before the Dominion had even existed. And yet, all of it wove together into a single, unholy whisper. "You were never meant to be here." The Grand Admiral's blood ran cold. The crew of the flagship was silent, as if they too had felt the weight of something they could not explain. The mistake must be undone. The whisper did not come from their communication systems. It did not originate from a source that could be pinpointed. It simply was, reverberating through the void, crawling through their minds like a cold wind from a graveyard. Then, without warning, the Dominion fleet started firing on itself. One of the destroyers, still intact but surrounded by the drifting ruins of its comrades, suddenly unleashed a full salvo into the side of a Dominion battlecruiser. The explosion was cataclysmic, splitting the massive vessel in half. "Who authorized that? What are they doing?" an officer shouted. No response. Then, another ship fired, this time on a squadron of Dominion fighters. One by one, more ships turned on each other, their crews helpless as their own command systems refused to obey. "They're not in control," the tactical officer whispered. "Their systems, they've been taken over." The Grand Admiral could barely process what was happening. The derelict fleet wasn't just attacking, it was consuming. Every Dominion ship still intact was being forcibly integrated into the ancient network, turned against its own allies. The Dominion was being absorbed, unwritten, and at the center of it all, motionless, untouched by the carnage, was the human warship. It had not fired a shot since the first two attacks that had wiped out their initial forces. It had no need to. The battle had already been decided before it began. It had simply waited. Waited for the Dominion to step too far to awaken something they could not control. And now it watched. There was no escape. But then, something changed. The flagship lurched violently, alarm screaming across the bridge. The Grand Admiral stumbled, grabbing onto the nearest console. "Report!" One of the officers turned, his face pale. "Something has locked onto us, but not a weapon." Then what? The answer came as the ship's lights dimmed, the very power of the flagship being drained from within. A creeping, crawling energy spread through the circuits, devouring the very essence of their systems. And for the first time in his long, storied career, the Grand Admiral understood what it meant to be hunted. The Dominion had always assumed itself to be the pinnacle of military evolution. It had crushed civilizations, subjugated species, rewritten history in its own image. And yet, it had never considered the possibility that it was merely the latest in a long line of mistakes. A mistake that the universe was now correcting. The derelicts surged forward, no longer mere remnants of dead empires, but a judgment passed down from the very fabric of time itself. Each one moved with terrifying coordination, their weapons firing not in chaotic fury, but in surgical precision. They were stripping the Dominion fleet down piece by piece, not destroying them outright, but repurposing them. Every ship they touched became one of theirs. And the human warship, silent and unmoving, was the architect of it all. The Grand Admiral turned to his crew, his expression hardened. He could not allow this fate to claim them. If escape was impossible, if their pleas were unheard, then there was only one option left. "Prepare for self-destruct," he ordered. The bridge crew hesitated. "Sir, if we are to be erased, then we will choose our own end," he said, his voice steady. "We will not become their tools." The crew exchanged uncertain glances, but one by one, they obeyed. The countdown began. 10. 9. 8. Across the fleet, Dominion captains realized what was happening. Desperate last messages were sent. Warnings, farewells, the pride of an empire reduced to whispered goodbyes in the void. 7. 6. The human warship still did not move. It did not try to stop them. 5. 4. Perhaps the Grand Admiral thought that was the lesson. Perhaps the humans did care. Perhaps this was their mercy. 3. 2. And then, the human warship disappeared. Vanished, not warped, not cloaked. It simply ceased to be. And in that same instant, 1. Nothing happened. The Dominion flagship still existed. The fleet still remained. What little of it was left. The countdown had reached 0, and yet, no explosion. The self-destruct command was gone, not overridden, not jammed, simply erased, as if it had never been an option to begin with. The Grand Admiral exhaled sharply, his hands shaking. And then, for the first time in his life, he did something no one in the Dominion's history had ever done. He prayed, not to the gods of his people, not to any divine entity of legend, but to whatever power had allowed him to survive, because whatever the humans had become, whatever they had awakened, the Dominion would never be the same again. The Dominion fleet, once an indomitable force of terror that had reshaped entire civilizations, now drifted in eerie silence. What few ships remained intact were unresponsive, locked in a technological grip beyond their comprehension. Their systems, their controls, their very ability to function as independent warships, all of it had been taken from them, and the human warship was gone, not destroyed, not cloaked, not warped out of the system. Gone. It was as if it had never existed. The Grand Admiral stood amidst the remnants of his once glorious armada, staring into the abyss beyond his command deck's viewport. He had fought wars across the stars, had crushed rebellions, orchestrated the fall of entire civilizations. He had outmaneuvered the greatest minds of his time, rewritten military doctrine itself. And yet, for all his brilliance, for all his victories, he had never felt so utterly insignificant. A quiet voice interrupted his thoughts. "Sir, the derelicts have stopped moving." The Grand Admiral turned sharply to face the officer, barely able to process what he had just heard. "Explain." The officer swallowed hard and gestured to the tactical display. The massive graveyard of ancient vessels, which had just moments ago been an unstoppable force rewriting the laws of warfare, had ceased all motion. The energy readings that had once pulsed like an otherworldly heartbeat had flickered out. Their weapons, which had torn through Dominion hulls as if they were paper, now lay dormant. And then, without warning, they began to drift. Not in coordinated formation. Not in the eerie, strategic movements that had defied physics before. They were dead again. As if whatever force had awakened them had suddenly vanished, along with the human warship. The bridge fell into stunned silence. It took several moments before the Grand Admiral found his voice. "Status report on all remaining ships." His officers scrambled, hands flying across damaged consoles, trying to piece together the wreckage of what was left of their fleet. After what felt like an eternity, the responses came in. Surviving ships, 79. Out of an armada of over 3,000. The Grand Admiral exhaled slowly, his grip tightening on the armrest of his chair. He had expected annihilation. He had accepted it. And yet, here he stood, alive, a survivor of an event that defied explanation. Transmission crackled through the comms. A broken, static-filled signal from one of the surviving captains. "Admiral, what are your orders?" Orders. For the first time in his life, the Grand Admiral had no answer. His mind raced. The Dominion had ruled for centuries, its iron fist unchallenged. Its military doctrine had been forged through war, sharpened through conquest. And yet, everything he had built, everything he had ever known, had just collapsed. Not by an invasion, not by an overwhelming force, by a single ship. A ship that had never needed to fire another shot after the battle had begun. A ship that had watched as an impossible force dismantled an empire's greatest fleet. Had the humans known? Had they anticipated this? Or had they merely played a dangerous game with forces even they did not control? The Grand Admiral turned his gaze back to the derelict fleet, now lifeless once more. Something had changed. Something beyond warfare, beyond technology, beyond even the Dominion's understanding of existence itself. The Dominion had built itself on the belief that it was invincible, that its technology was supreme, that its war machine was unstoppable. But today, the illusion had been shattered, because somewhere out there, hidden in the shadows of the cosmos, humanity possessed something greater. Not just superior weaponry, not just advanced tactics, but knowledge. Knowledge of forces the Dominion had never even conceived of. Knowledge of a war that was far older than any empire in the known galaxy. And the most terrifying realization of all, the humans had barely lifted a finger. The battle had been won until the human warship arrived and changed everything. The Grand Admiral let out a slow breath. His voice was quiet when he finally spoke. "Send a transmission to High Command." The officers turned to him, waiting for the words that would reshape the future of the Dominion. "We retreat. Immediately." A moment of stunned silence followed. Retreat? The Dominion never retreated. But no one questioned him. No one dared. One by one, what remained of the Dominion fleet turned, their battered forms slipping into the void, leaving behind the silent graveyard of derelict ships. And somewhere, in the vast darkness of space, the human warship watched. Waiting.